Hey guys, and welcome back to another live design tutorial here on our Graphic Designer Pro YouTube channel. Really glad you could all make it here today, and hopefully you will be able to learn a thing or two from what we're going to cover. So as usual, this doubles up as a Q&A as well, so anyone who is watching this live, do feel free to ask me any questions if you have them throughout this whole video, if it's related to what we're looking at, or just design related questions for that matter. I'm happy to do my best to help out. So with that being said, we're going to be taking a look at the transform tools in Adobe Illustrator 2021. Now, these are fairly simple tools in what they do. They do quite fundamental things, but there's actually a lot of designers, especially new designers new to the software, that don't know about them or don't know that they're there and that they can be utilized, and they can be very useful in a lot of different applications. So let's just jump straight in. We are going to head over to Illustrator now. Let me just get that up. There we go. So yeah, here we are in Illustrator. I've got a simple artboard set up here, nothing special going on, but we are going to create a few elements and take a look at the transform tool. So let's start by just grabbing my type tool here, and let's just put in some, we'll just leave it as Lorem Ipsum for now. This is just an example anyway, as is always the case with these design tutorials. So let's invert that to be white text as well, why not? So these transform tools can work with live text, outline text, or just vector designs, so anchor points and paths. They can really be used with anything that you're working with in Illustrator, which is very useful. We can also access them via a number of ways. So they can be found over in the left-hand toolbar for starters. So we're technically looking at 4 different tools here, but they all fall under transform effects, if that makes sense. So we've got, first of all, the rotate tool, then we've got the reflect tool. So they're bundled together, and then to the right of that we have the scale tool and the shear tool. Now there is also the reshape tool within here, but I would say that's not really a transform tool. It doesn't really fall under what we're looking at, and in all honesty, I very rarely use the reshape tool for the things I work on. It tends to be these other four that are going to be used a lot more. So let's start with the rotate tool. We'll just work on these in order of how they appear in the toolbar. Another thing we can do, in fact, let's just grab my selection tool. Let's not do what I was just going to say. You can also just right click on the object that you want to apply a transform effect to, and down here we have transform. This opens up another sub menu, and you can see we have the same tools within here. So we've got rotate, reflect, scale, and shear. We also have move within here as well. Now we don't have a move tool per se, but we do have our selection tool, and if I was to click that, it's the equivalent of double clicking on your selection tool as well. We can actually enter precise pixel values to move our selection. If you're I don't know, working with something very precise that you need to move something by a set amount of pixels or a set distance or angle, this can be useful. I can't say I've had to use it that much, but it's good to know that it's there at the same time. So I'm just going to click cancel. What we'll do instead is I'm just going to right click, go down to transform, and we'll look at our first one, which is the shear tool. So I say it's the shear tool. We can use this via the tool, or we can go in via this menu. If I click on shear, we get a pop-up here, and you can already get an idea of what this is doing. So we have up at the top a shear angle. If I just set this back to 0, it's just going to return our text back to what we started with. And we also have an axis option. So we can either select horizontal or vertical. If I select horizontal and bump our shear angle up, you can see this is essentially italicizing this text. It's putting a slant on it. So this is a useful little hack if you ever have a font that you're working with and you want to put it into a slightly more italicized version, but it doesn't have an italics font as part of the typeface. This is a little workaround that you can use. Obviously, it's not ideal if you're dealing with big paragraphs of text, but for something like a logo, potentially, this can be very useful. So we've got that, and we also have the vertical option, which is what we had set first. And you can see with a positive angle, it's kind of pushing the left side up and pushing the right side down. With this one, I prefer to use a negative value and go for something like this that's kind of angling up the way. This can be quite effective. We also have an angle down at the bottom as well. If I'm to check that, that's going to basically adjust the angle that the baseline's sitting at as well. To be honest, I don't tend to touch the angle that much. I tend to just stick with either the horizontal or vertical values, as I think it gives for a nicer look. So if you wanted to get away from those precise vertices, you can use the angle option. It is always there. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. You could double it up as well. I could right click again. Another way of doing this, by the way, is going up to Object in the top menu. Transform is the first option, and we get the same set of options here as well. So let's click shear once again. This time we'll click the horizontal option. And if we bump this up the way this time, we can kind of italicize it as well. So we're kind of using both the horizontal and vertical shear in this case. So I can click OK. So yeah, that's where the shear tool can work. Where it's more useful, I would say, though, is if you're actually applying this to multiple objects at the same time. So if I wanted to create a bit of a slant or something like that, it can be tricky to do that. You can do it relatively easily with just a single object, but if you want to apply that same angle to multiple objects, that's where this can be useful, because we're dealing with precise degrees. So for example, let's just create a box around this text. That's not a box, that's an ellipse. Get the right tool. Let's just drag one roughly a little bit bigger than it. I'll just set a color here. We'll go with a kind of blue color, and I'll send this to the back. And lastly, I'll just center these up. So this is just a very simple example here. Let's even just slightly round those corners, why not? So don't need to group them. I can just select them, click and drag over both, and we'll do the same thing. In fact, this time, let's actually grab the shear tool. So again, this sits underneath the scale tool on the left-hand side, shear, and you can see just by selecting the tool, we're not getting that same pop-up. This works slightly differently in that I would actually click and drag to apply the shear effect. If I hold shift, it's going to lock it to certain angles. If I'm honest, I think with the shear tool, this is harder to get right just by clicking and dragging. I would normally always use the pop-up because we can be more precise with it. So I could press Command Z, and instead I can just double click on the tool and we'll just get that same pop-up here. So again, we've got our shear angle, and let's just apply a slight shear to this. We'll say 12 degrees. That's fine. Click OK. So you can see that the angles of both objects, the text and the box, are completely matching up. The other nice thing about this is if we're applying this to something like text, you can see all of the vertical strokes or stems within the text are all still completely vertical. So that's where this can be useful. It's only applying an angle to the vertices of your choosing. So the shear tool, very useful, and we can create some really interesting looking designs with it. Let's move on though. We will go back this time and we'll have a look at the rotate tool. So let's just create something very simple first. I'm going to grab my ellipse tool and I'm just going to create a duplicate holding Alt or Option and click and drag over both. Let's go over to my Pathfinder and use the intersect option, so we're left with this sort of leaf shape here. And I might even just flip that to be a stroke instead. Let's bump the stroke weight up as well. So we've got a sort of simple sort of leaf shape here. If I grab my rotate tool, again, similar to the shear tool, I can start just clicking and dragging, and that's simply going to rotate the object. So nothing particularly special. We can just use our selection tool to do this normally, and press Command Z. You will notice though that we've got this cyan crosshair in the middle. So this is our point of rotation, and we can move this around, or hopefully we can. Sometimes you need to click off and back on the tool to actually change this, or not at all. It's just being slightly awkward. There we go. So you have to be quite precise with where you click it. But this basically will change the point of rotation. So I could drag it off here, and now if I click and drag on this, you can see this is rotating around this point. So again, this can be useful if you want to rotate something in a specific way. Where it can also be useful is if you wanted to rotate something round a circle, for example. So if you wanted to almost duplicate this object from a certain point. So let's take a look at that. What I can do is, well, in fact, let's look at a few different ways we can do this. I could double click on the tool again. So that's going to bring up our rotate panel once more. So this is the same as if you were to right click and go to transform, then rotate, or go up to object, transform, rotate. We're getting the same panel up here, and we can enter a precise degrees, angle of degrees. And the cool thing about any of these dialog boxes, if you don't already know, is that we can actually do simple maths with them. So for example, if we wanted to create a series of this object rotating round a circle, but we wanted to make sure that they were being rotated at a precise angle that, there's equal distance between each of them. I can explain this better just by showing you probably. What we would need to do is find out, what angle of degrees would be needed to do that correctly. So what we could do is type in 360, because there's 360 degrees in a circle. And then I can hit the / key. So that's basically creating a divide. If you were doing simple maths, it's 360 divided by, and then the number of objects you want to rotate. So in this case, let's just say 10. We can keep this quite simple. Obviously, I could work this out myself. It's quite simple, but by doing that, I could just check and uncheck and check preview, and you can see that's automatically worked that out as 36 degrees. Now, in this case, we have our crosshairs still sitting in the middle of this object, so it's not really going to work. But what we can do as well from here, instead of hitting OK, and that's just going to rotate the object we have selected, we also have this copy button. So by clicking copy, that's actually going to create a copy of the object while also applying that rotation. From this point, even easier is that we can do the exact same step that we just took with a shortcut. So by pressing Command or Control D, that's basically transforming it again. And we can do this by right-clicking, go to Transform, and you'll see we have up at the top here, Transform Again. So it's just applying the exact same parameters that we just applied, but the shortcut, Command, Control D, I can keep doing this, and you can see we've created a kind of flower shape this way. So let's press Command Z a few times. So let's go back to what we started with. I'm going to click on the rotate tool once more. And another thing we can do with the crosshair is by holding Option, I can click and drag on it, and that's going to move. I could equally snap it to an anchor point, so you can see, well, hopefully see that my smart guides are working here. I can snap it to this bottom anchor point, and if I let go, that's automatically going to bring up this rotate dialog box here. So we can do the exact same thing. Maybe in this case, I'm just going to stick to 45 degrees, click copy, press Command D to do it once more, and then we can move on to our next tool. Actually, it's probably quite a good segue into the next tool. So say I wanted to now reflect these two onto the opposite side. That is also very easy with our reflect tool. So again, click and hold on the rotate tool, and we have the reflect tool here. You'll hopefully also be able to see that the keyboard shortcuts for the rotate tool is R, for the reflect tool it's O on the keyboard. So they're always good to know. And yeah, here we go. We've got our reflection. So this kind of works in a similar way in that if I zoom in here, we have another crosshair that's always going to default to the center of your selection. So we don't also have to use any of these on individual selections. We've got obviously two vector paths selected here, and it's going to apply to both of them. So if I was to just click and drag, this is technically rotating. It's kind of hard to tell, reflecting. It's kind of hard to tell because it just looks like it's rotating, but if you had a more asymmetrical design, it would be more obvious. So I can reflect it this way. I'm just going to press Command Z. Where this is more useful again though is if you move the point of reflection around. So again, I can do this by clicking and dragging. Again, it's got to be quite precise when you're just clicking and dragging. Normally it's easier to just Option, click and drag, and then you get the dialog box popping up. So that's what I'm going to do in this case. Hold Option, and you can see this is moving this time. Again, using my smart guides, I can basically put our point of reflection on that anchor point sitting within the middle of our original object. So that's what I want. Click and let go. And you can see we get another dialog box popping up, this time for the reflect tool. And this is where we get our options. So similar to the shear tool, we've got horizontal and vertical reflection, or we can set an angle. Again, in most cases, I'm dealing with horizontal or vertical. It's quite rare that I need to set a precise angle. In this case, I'd want it to be the vertical. And because we've set our point of reflection in the middle of that, you can see this is reflecting perfectly. Again, in this case, I'd want to click copy though, so it's actually creating a copy of those, and it's now reflecting perfectly. Now, where this tool is maybe less relevant these days is because we can do this with a click of a button nowadays. So if I just click and drag over these objects we've created, the only thing I do need to do is create a duplicate first. So I could press Command C and Command F if I wanted to. In fact, what I'm going to do is press Command Z. I don't want to do that. I'm just going to select these top three here. So not worrying about the two at the bottom because they'll just get duplicated in this case. So Command C, Command F, all that's doing is just, creating a duplicate of them. And over in my properties panel, under the transform section, we have these two shortcut icons. So they are for flipping horizontally or flipping vertically. So this makes it even easier. We don't even have to use the reflect tool a lot of the time now. One thing though is that you want to pay attention to where the point of reflection is anchored to. So we can't be as precise with this. You can see we've got it in the middle. It will always default to be in the middle of the selection, but I'm hoping you can see this all right. It may be quite small on your screens, but over in the properties, if I clicked the bottom center point, that means it's going to reflect from the middle bottom of the selection, or we've got, bottom right, top left, all of these little squares, they denote where it's going to reflect from. So if I was to click flip vertically now, you can see we're getting the desired effect of that reflecting on the bottom. So yeah, simple but useful to know. Obviously as well, with these examples, we also have the new repeat features. We have a video on that. If you've not checked it out, check our other videos. I think it's in the Adobe Illustrator playlist that makes things like this, that what we've just created, even easier. You don't even have to worry about being as precise. You can do it much more intuitively. So by going up to Object and Repeat, and then it would be the radial repeat for something like that. And then we've also got Grid and Mirror as well. So they're also very useful. Now, what am I going to try next? So we've still got to look at the Scale tool. So it has definitely some good uses as well. So what I'm going to do is just drag out a simple rectangle to show how it works. So obviously for scaling items, again, you would tend to use just your selection tool, and you can click and drag, hold shift to lock the aspect ratio. But we can use the scale tool. I use it more for specific anchor points. So if I grab my direct selection tool, I'm going to click and drag across the bottom 2 anchor points. Now I'm going to grab my scale tool, S on the keyboard is the shortcut, and with just those bottom 2 anchor points selected, again we've got this crosshair in the middle, so I can move that around if I wanted to change where these are scaling from, but let's just try and roughly get that in the middle. If I click and drag on these, you can see it's only moving those 2 anchor points. If I go up and down, it's not going to affect it. It's just, they're going to stay on that plane, but they are essentially scaling in, closer to the point of scale or further away. So instead of having to, select one point and nudge it a set amount of movements away and then do the same on the other side, we can just select both of them and do it this way. It's slightly easier. Another area where it can be useful is if you're using patterns. So I'm going to grab this text here, and I'm just going to create a duplicate. So Command C, Command F, and I'm going to slightly nudge this so it's offset. So just with my arrow keys, we'll just go with something like that, quite simple. And I'm going to apply a simple pattern to this. So if you didn't already know, there are some default patterns already set up within Illustrator that are actually really quite good. So if I open my swatches panel, I can go to the top right mini menu, then down to Open Swatch Library, down to Patterns, and then Basic Graphics lines. So that, well, you can choose any of these. Obviously, I'm going to choose basic graphic lines in this case. It'll open up a separate box here, and we basically have a bunch of preset line patterns already set up within here. So what I'm going to do is, I'll maybe go with that. It doesn't, this is just an example at the end of the day. I'm just going to cross that off for now. So what we can also do is I could right click on this, or to be honest, I could just double click on my scale tool. So let's do that. And you can see, because of the default settings here, this is kind of making this text go crazy. I'm going to click uniform at the top, so it's going to basically scale things proportionately. But down here, you'll notice we have the option to check either transform objects or transform patterns, or both. In this case, I'm going to uncheck transform objects so that it's only going to affect the pattern within being applied to the object. So if I go back up to uniform, I could say make this 50% of the original size, and you can see I can just bump this down with my arrow keys. This is adjusting the scale only of the pattern, which is pretty cool. So let's go with, 34%, for example. Click OK, and we've completely adjusted that pattern. So this can be really useful. I could also do it with the rotate tool, for example. Let's double click on the rotate tool. Again, we have this option to uncheck transform objects. This is set at 45 degrees. I like that as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And yeah, we can use these with patterns as well as the objects themselves. So that's really it for an overview of these transform tools. Like I say, they are quite simple, but they are a fundamental part of working in Illustrator, and they are really good to get used to using as well, especially when you're dealing with very precise designs. If you're doing things like a lot of logo design or icons, these are a real lifesaver a lot of the time. So I'd highly recommend that you check them out. So that's really it. One last thing before I go is that we have a free design workshop running at the moment that you can check out if you want to learn a little bit more about some professional techniques for graphic designing, obviously. So we cover 5 key areas of graphic design that to improve upon. It's something that we notice a lot of amateur designers you know, maybe not paying enough attention to, and, you know, how you can improve on those areas and, yeah, start to create more professional looking designs. So I'm just going to pop that in the chat now if you want to check that out. There is a link to it there. Good to see Suede. You're commenting saying you're late to the party, but looking forward to this. Glad to hear that. Again, anyone watching this retrospectively as well, be sure to comment as well, because we always check our comments. So if you've got any questions on what we've covered, you know, we will get back to you. So don't worry if you haven't caught this on time, or if you're a bit late, anything like that. Do not worry, we will be sure to answer any questions. But yeah, I think that will probably do it for today, guys. I'll be back hopefully again next week with another live tutorial, but keep your eyes on the channel. We've got lots of exciting new content coming up, some more motion design videos as well for those of you into After Effects and things. So yeah, definitely keep your eye on the channel for lots of new content. Okay, I'll see you in the next one, guys.